My name is Kylie Hansen. I'm one of the founding directors of Impact Seed. And before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge that we meet on Noongar country, and I want to pay respects to elders past and present. And I also want to just give you a bit of an update of what we spent the morning breakfast doing. Some of you were in that room and some unfortunately couldn't be. So we launched the Impact Investment Alliance of WA this morning. And that alliance is intended to be something that's trying to change the nature of the conversation around finance in Western Australia. And I think Dan and Dan, who were in the room, put this really well when they talked about the fact that the current finance system is not set up well for thinking about, well, what do we actually want to use the finance for? What are the social outcomes and the impact that we're actually trying to achieve? And so the idea is, with the Alliance, providing a group of people who are interested in how we are doing impact investment in WA a bit differently, and how we're changing the nature of that narrative and that conversation to be about the social impact just as much as it's about the finance and the financial return. So look out for more information about the Alliance, and if that's something that is of interest to you to learn a bit more about, please feel free to come and speak to Sven or I, or Dan, or others that are in the room that can talk a bit about that during the break. So here we are here today going to look at Impact Investment and Blended Finance Masterclass. So you'll hear from two really great presenters, Dan Madhavan.
Close.
No, do it again.
Madhavan.
Madhavan. I realise I've been saying his name wrong literally the entire time I've known him. And Hanna Ebeling I've probably got it wrong again. From Social Enterprise Finance Australia. It's important we get your name right, guys. So we are going to go straight onto presentations from the both of them. But before we do that, I guess I just wanted to say thanks for being here. I think I spoke about what the roundtable intent was this morning, but I suppose this is part of, and all of you are now part of that sort of changing the nature of the conversation as well, by coming here and being a part of the masterclass. All right, and I should tell you a little bit about Impact Seed for those that do not know what Impact Seed is. So we are a capacity builder for the market for impact investment in Western Australia. So we're looking at how we can build social enterprises and work in social enterprise development, but also look at the finance side of that as well. So as I mentioned, we're going to have Dan and then Hanna, opportunities in and for WA. So we're going to talk a bit about the WA Impact Fund, I think we're still talking about that, and some other opportunities that exist. And then we're going to have an intermediary panel. So we're going to have Dan and Hanna and Sven, and Emma's going to ably chair that panel to answer any questions that you have about social finance, impact investment, blended finance, and that will take us through to 12:30. We'll be done. Because I did ask many of you to fill in a pre-survey, and I don't like to ask for information without giving you something back, I just thought I'd give you a sense of what came through that survey before I answered it. So at the point at which I did this analysis, there had been 13 responses, but there has since been more, so thank you very much for filling that in. In terms of the understanding and knowledge of social impact investment in the room, we've got an average of about 5.3 out of 10, which is great, because we're going to talk a bit more about that and hopefully build that knowledge and understanding. The understanding and knowledge of blended finance, about 4.6 out of 10, so it's probably quite good that this event is primarily focused on talking a bit more about what blended finance is. And in terms of what people are keen to hear more about, we've got the social impact measurement of investments, and that was actually a really key conversation topic that came up this morning as well in the roundtable. The financial return of investments and examples of investments. And so in that vein, we have Hanna and Dan talking a little bit about some examples of the measurement in the investments that they'll talk about. But Dan's got a couple of additional slides that we'll go through around measurement. And in addition, Wiz Impact Seed will run an impact measurement masterclass later in the year and keep you informed about that.
Which you are all invited to come along to.
Yes, to be
included.
Yes. So, without further ado, I'll invite Dan up to talk a bit about general impact investment.
Thank you, Kylie. Good morning, everyone. I'd also just like to take the opportunity to acknowledge the traditional owners or custodians of the land on which we meet today, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. Don't worry about my name, everybody gets that wrong. So it's actually Indian, way back when. So my dad is half Indian, half Chinese. The name comes from the Indian side. My mother is Dutch, blonde-haired, blue-eyed Dutch. My wife is French Creole, so she is from Mauritius. She's half French, but from the island of Mauritius. And in terms of getting my name wrong, I'm so used to it being mispronounced. It does not impact me whatsoever, and I can't blame anyone because my wife's Mauritian, so she's Catholic. We got married in a Catholic church, and I was so nervous during the ceremony. The priest said, "I, Daniel Madhavan," which is the wrong pronunciation of my name, and I said, "I, Daniel Madhavan," so I pronounced my own name wrong. And the only thing I heard from the front row was my mum go, "Oh." So probably not the thing you want to hear when you're doing your wedding vows, is your mum go, "Oh," but it was just in relation to the name. So I'm going to talk a little bit about impact investing, and my role this morning is sort of just to bring everyone from a 5.3 hopefully to a 7+ in terms of understanding of impact investment. What I'm going to do to start that is do something very dangerous, which is, firstly it's not dangerous. I'm going to share a couple of analogies with you because I like talking in analogy and metaphor, but I'm actually going to give you two that are paradoxical, and I'm going to ask you to hold both of those two in balance. So the first analogy I'm going to give you is put your hand up if I describe the following animal and you know what animal I'm talking about, put your hand up. So it's an animal that has the bill of a duck, the tail of a beaver, and the feet of an otter. Would anyone know what animal I'm talking about? Okay, great. Now, keep your hand up if you know, keep your hand up, keep your hand up. Now, keep your hand up if you believe that animal is actually the product of some bizarre love triangle between those three animals that I mentioned. Okay. So nobody believes that, of course I'm talking about the platypus, no one believes that it is actually some bizarre product of a beaver, otter and a duck, which I don't even want to go into that, but we all get that it's not, right? But it's interesting, so when the very first Europeans came to Australia and then went back to Europe, to England, and described that animal in the way that I described it, they actually thought it was a hoax. They thought that's ridiculous. There can be no such animal which is a combination of those three things. And impact investing is a little bit the same in that it has characteristics which are a little bit government, right? So you're looking often for public good, you're looking for social outcomes, you're looking for things where often government has traditionally played a role in. You're looking for a little bit of philanthropy, so there's a little bit of sort of innovative approaches to the way that things work. There's private money being deployed in a way for social outcomes. And it's a little bit investment. You're actually looking for a financial return. The financial system, mainstream financial system, can bring a lot of things to impact investment. So it's actually, if you look at it, it has elements of all three, okay? But it is not some weird mash of those three things together. It's actually its own thing. Okay? Just like the platypus is its own animal, when you look at it as its own animal, that's the only way it actually makes sense, right? The same thing, impact investment, when you look at it as its own thing, as a thing that stands on its own, that's when it will make most sense. Because if you're looking at it trying to jam those three weird things together, it doesn't work, right? Albeit that we all, as humans, take concepts that are familiar to us, to build new concepts. That's what we're doing when we talk about the platypus or we talk about impact investment. We try and take concepts that we're familiar with to bring it to a new concept. But the opportunity is to just, if you do that, it will be limiting. Okay, so it's a good way to kind of get introduced to it. But what we're going to talk about today is how does it stand on its own 2 feet, 4 feet if it's a platypus. So the other analogy I'm going to talk about is it is also a very big house. Okay, impact investing can be very, very confusing for people because it has so many different rooms. And so many, have you ever been in a house that has like, I grew up in a house that has 2 doors, front door, back door, that's it, right? Have you ever been in one of those houses that's got like 10 different ways you can get into the house, okay? Impact investing is kind of like that. If you're from government, you're going to enter the door that says government enter here, and you come in the first room and there's all these people talking about social policy and social impact bonds and commissioning for outcomes and all of these sorts of things. And if you're from government, that feels really familiar and there's a language that you talk, and that's, for you, that's impact investment. but you've missed that there's another 20 rooms in the house, and you're just looking at it in the room that you're familiar with. Now, heaven forbid you're from, I don't know, venture capital, and you walk into that room, you will go, what the hell is going on here? I have no idea what people are talking about. This is not for me, and out you go immediately. Likewise, if you come at it from a philanthropic, you go through the philanthropist door. Over here, you walk in, you stand in the room, and there's people talking about how we measure outcomes better, how we use philanthropic dollars better, and how we could start to look at innovative things about repayable grants, and how do we use our corpus, not just our grants for good and aligning to our mission. And that will work for you because that's a language you talk, and that room is built for you. But again, if you're the government person walking into that door, you're like, whoa, what is going on here? I understand not what these people are talking about. So depending on what room you enter, you will get a very different experience of what impact investing is. But how do we actually understand that all of those none of those are wrong answers? Okay, they're all right answers. They're just different parts of the house. So I'm asking you to kind of hold these two. On one hand, I'm telling you, you've got to look at it as the whole. And on the other hand, I'm telling you, you've got to look at it as in its component parts, depending on which room you want to be in and which room is relevant to your work. And kind of try and hold those two things in balance as we talk about some of the, I guess, technical, definitional stuff around what impact investing is. So, that's the pointer. I should probably introduce myself, shouldn't I? So I lead Impact Investment Group. So we're a fund manager, an impact investment fund manager, and we are based in Melbourne. We've got a couple of people up in Sydney as well. We have our whole reason for being is around proving that finance can be a force for good, that finance can be used in a way that serves us, not in a way that we serve it. So that is our reason for being. We do that in 3 areas. So we do that maybe working backwards. We want to be part of financing businesses for good. What I mean by that is there is this emerging both movement and kind of growing group of people in business, whether they be entrepreneurs, whether they be executives, whether they be social entrepreneurs, people that want to use business for something other than just making money, okay? So they want to use it for some type of social or environmental purpose. And we, as a group, our role, we see our role as we are asking ourselves, how do we support those businesses? How do we support those entrepreneurs? We want to support them with capital, because that's the skills that we have. We want to figure out how do we support those businesses with capital, and how do we support them with the right type of capital? So, we can see that for many of those businesses, they'll get access to capital, but often the challenge is that capital does not care about the social or environmental outcomes that the entrepreneur or the business care or the enterprise cares about. So how do we support it with capital that cares? Energy, we look at the energy market here in Australia and we say it is not renewable, it is not affordable, it is not reliable. We think we can play a role in helping to move it to a more, our vision is for an Australia that's powered 100% by renewables, and that is affordable for everyday people. And we think that's a very achievable aim. We run solar farms and solar funds, and we've also got a wind portfolio to do that. And the built environment, where we feel, so 30% of all carbon emissions come from the built environment. And I would say also how developers tend to go into communities and kind of fight the community to develop what works for them is not the model we think is going to serve us in the future. How do we develop in co-design with community? How do we develop for community? And how do we use the built environment to support vibrant communities? So we do a whole bunch of stuff in pipeline. Okay, impact investing. So just so that we're clear, it is investing. So you are looking for a financial return. So what I mean by that is not a notional financial return, an actual financial return. At a minimum, if you put $1,000 into something, getting that $1,000 back at least, that's an investment. So better than zero, okay, is investing. That doesn't mean that philanthropy is not amazing. I love philanthropy. Doesn't mean that non-profit activities are not amazing or granting is not amazing. Those are all incredibly important activities, but it is not impact investment. So it's not to comment that those things are better or worse, it's just different. That is not impact investment. Impact investment is where you are looking for some type of financial return. Okay? So how investors, from an investor perspective, think about their investments is an easy way to define what's impact and not. So a way of thinking about investing is to go, I'm going to invest money, maybe you've sold your house, you've got a spare $100,000 and you want to invest that somewhere. You could invest that and not care at all, care is the wrong word, not be conscious at all about what impact that money is having. So you might lend it to someone and go, I don't really, as long as I get my good return, I'm not really worried about how that money is used. Okay? And actually, our whole financial system has pretty much been built on that for a very, very long time. Okay? What we've seen over the last 20 or 30 years to become more mainstream is this idea of responsible investing or ethical investing or ESG investing, or there's probably 10 other words I could use, but this idea that I want to exclude a bunch of things over here, okay? I want to limit my investments to things that are not doing any harm. Okay, so I want to exclude a bunch of things that, from a values perspective, and values are subjective, so what's important to you might be different to what's important to you. It might be for you, you say, look, I care deeply about climate change, I don't want to be invested in a coal company, or I don't want to be invested in a coal-fired power company. Or you might say, I don't want to be, so a great example is, many of you might have heard of Dr. Bronwyn King, was an oncologist at Peter Mac, and found out that her super money was invested in tobacco companies, which is like, she's like, what are you talking about? Like, this is my industry super fund that doctors invest in, and you're telling me that it's invested in tobacco companies, and I'm spending my whole life helping people with cancer. Like, that makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. So she's run a global campaign called Tobacco-Free Portfolios, which is all about making sure that big pension funds, big superannuation funds are not invested in tobacco. So that would be responsible investing. Impact investing is going another and sort of limiting that universe again to say, not only do I not want to do harm, but I actually want to deliberately look for things that can support positive social outcomes or environmental outcomes that I care about. Okay? Does that make sense? I'm going to talk a little bit about what some of those things are. Feel free to dive in with questions if you've got them. I want to take about 10 minutes from here just to do a bit of explanation. One of the things that we do talk about in impact investing is A, B, C. So is it something that is avoiding harm, which is more responsible investing? Is it something that's benefiting people and the planet? So a more general benefit. So, like solar farm, more generally, you could look at impact metrics around carbon emissions avoided. Okay, that's benefiting a general group, like all of us, versus C, which is contribute to solutions. So actually looking at a very specific social or environmental problem and saying, I want to invest in something that's quite deliberately looking at contributing to a solution to that problem. And that can just help sometimes when you look at something and go, I'm not sure how impactful is that relative to this thing which seems very impactful. It can just help you to kind of frame, well, is it trying to avoid harm, is it trying to benefit people on the planet, or is it trying to actually contribute to a very specific solution? Why impact investment? I would say three things. One is climate emergency and what's happening around the world, and what most people are recognising is that the way we are living, or what we have developed, we're on a pathway which is completely unsustainable and is damaging our planet. There is a recognition that the system is also wealth is accruing to a smaller and smaller number of people, even though the fact that we are as wealthy as we've ever been in human history, that the distribution of that wealth is as out of whack as it has ever been. And you can see all the stats from Oxfam around, 80 people, is it 80 people, 60 people? I can't remember the number. The richest 60 people in the world have more wealth than the bottom 3 billion people which will tell you that that's way out of whack. And thirdly, I think just as we've built all of this wealth, particularly post-World War II, as developed countries, that wealth has been put into the hands of the financial system to say, hey, can you guys manage this for me? Typically guys, can you guys manage this for me? And they haven't always done a great job, either financially or definitely with how ethics or morality has been applied to how that money has been deployed. And so you only need to look at the most recent Royal Commission into the banking sector to get more than enough examples around that.
Dan, does the impact investment sort of end of the spectrum talk about the changing nature of the social challenge, if you like? So I come mainly from a health background, and we know that the health system was designed for a day when people got sick, they got better or they died. And these days we live for a very long time with lots of complex diseases. So that's completely changed the nature of the health challenge. And you can talk more broadly about any social challenge you like, and most of them have gone down that. So it's much more complex, it's much longer lasting, and so on. And most of the old ways of working they're expensive and they're reactive. Does that ever get talked about as a rationale behind impact investing, or is that obviously the thread you're more familiar with?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, it probably doesn't fall, well, at least it probably falls under some broader themes than being as specific as, say, health. And I'm sure the health conversation absolutely does happen. But I think there's some broader themes in the impact investment world or conversation where that does come up, particularly around innovation emergence. So how are we adapting to these different problems, and how is finance, how are we using money as we adapt to and create new solutions, as we reimagine how things could be, right? Who is providing resources to the people that are reimagining?
The traditional way of financing it doesn't drive innovation and those sorts of things.
No, and so you will see those as themes, innovation and emergence, as things that you'll often hear as part of the language in impact investing. Yes. There's a bit of a history, this kind of actually thinking about how money is used is not a new topic. I think how we're applying that is probably in newer ways or different contexts, but it's not a new topic. I'm going to cover that. I'm going to cover the measurement stuff in a minute. There's, depending on what level you want to have a look at how measurement happens. I'll talk a little bit about measurement later. There's a whole bunch of things that have happened at a global level: the Paris Accords, the Sustainable Development Goals in the UN. There's things that are sort of considered best practice that have emerged, and you might think they're best practice, you might not. That's for you to judge. But things like the Impact Management Project, which I'll talk about later, and there's plenty of networks and associations, and I know even with the Alliance here, I'm sure that will be part of a more local conversation about how these things get applied. Just to give you a sense of how big this is, in 2016 in Australia there was about just over $1 billion of impact investments in Australia. That's now, it's at about $14 billion at the moment, so growing quite rapidly. The vast bulk of that has been in green bonds. Okay, so if you took green bonds out, the growth is still very, very impressive, but nowhere near as impressive as whatever that is 10 times. Are these the most impactful end of the impact investing spectrum? Generally speaking, in my opinion, no. But they play a role. Okay, so again, depending on where you or your organisation or you as an investor or a user of capital wants to work, you don't have to come up with a green bond. You could come up with a social impact bond if you wanted to. It is a very broad church. It's happening all around the world. Some of you might be familiar with, so I'm off to SOCAP, the Social Capital Conference in October again this year. So there's about 3,000 people get together in the US every year to kind of talk impact investing. And The question of returns, I know that was one of the questions that got asked in the feedback. This gives you a pretty basic snapshot. About 2/3 of people want financial returns plus impact. Okay, so they're as investors, they're saying, I want to invest and I want to invest for impact, but I want it to be a plus impact. Okay, I'm not interested, or I'm not open to compromising my returns based on the social outcomes. Okay? And that number is pretty consistent globally. There's been many sort of surveys and whatnot. About 20% are actually open to the conversation to say, if there's some great outcomes here, I'm really open to taking a lower financial return. Okay? And then there's about 15% that are just saying, look, as long as I get my money back and the social returns are there, I'm happy. Okay, so I don't want to lose any money, but as long as I get my money back and I'm happy with the social returns, that's a good outcome for me. And sorry, we'll send the slides around, but in terms of how people are feeling about their expectations, whether their expectations as an impact investor are being met, about 80% are happy with it's in line with their expectations on impact, and about the same number for the financial returns. Just gives you a sense for how is this all going. I think an interesting stat, which I don't have a stat on this, but I would say in terms of users of that money, so as a social entrepreneur, are they happy with how impact investing is going? I think that would be a much bigger mixed bag of responses. Okay, because I would say that there's groups of entrepreneurs that are very happy with having impact investing dollars in their enterprise, and then there's others that would say this just has not worked for me. This is like there was this big promise around impact investing, and it has not delivered to date. And then how am I going for 2 minutes? Give a couple of examples. Here's some examples of different areas where impact investing is happening. So it is happening in private equity is a big chunk, like private companies, investing in private companies where there is a social or environmental. The most famous example in Australia, which is still doing the rounds, is the Good Start transaction, which happened many years ago, where ABC Learning Centres was about to go bust, and a non-profit consortium bought out that. It was Australia's largest network of childcare centres, and now they run that as a non-profit activity. That's ABC. That's Good Start Early Learning, and that was financed through the banks and also a big chunk of money from impact investors, which at the time was meant to be a sort of below market rate. But then the GFC happened, and I think it was probably the best performing investment that most people had in their portfolio. So it shows that some of all the theory doesn't work out in practice all the time. Property infrastructure, we talked this morning about housing, obviously a huge opportunity if someone can kind of figure out models that work, both in affordable housing, social housing. There's also a lot in the green building space. And in infrastructure, we play in the renewable energy space, but there's other things around healthcare infrastructure, for example, that are opportunities for impact investing as well. Debt finance, I think a lot of where it probably has worked better for many social entrepreneurs is forms of debt. So that's an area where there are lots of opportunities, and social impact bonds, which are actually the smallest part by dollar of the market, but because they're probably the pointiest end of impact investing, they tend to get a lot of interest, and there's a lot of conversation around it. So, before I hand over to Hanna, maybe, can I just talk a little bit about the measurement? Did you want me to touch on that, or are you going to talk about it? Okay, that's fine. So I have adapted my presentation this morning because I saw the responses, which was there was a lot of interest in measurement. Caveat: measurement is, I am not an expert in measurement. I know enough to be dangerous, not enough to be lethal. But I'm going to share what sort of how we're thinking about it internally, Maybe for the measurement thing, we could get, we might even think about whether Erin from our team can support you guys in that presentation. So we have our Chief Impact Officer, sustainability and measurement. That is not me, but I know enough about it to share some ideas, or at least how we're thinking about it internally at IRG. So we think about measurement on 3 different levels. Okay, so at the highest level, we use the Sustainable Development Goals as pointers towards things that as pointers from either a fund that we're managing or an individual asset. So we can look at every single asset that we own or that we manage, and we can say, for this asset, the Sustainable Development Goal that applies is this, and sometimes it may be 2 or 3. Okay, but we map everything that we do to the Sustainable Development Goals. Why do we do that? One is it's a bit of just a kind of sanity check in some ways, to say, well, are we doing something that's actually aligned to what the kind of world has agreed, to the extent the world can agree on anything, is a good way of kind of categorising where we're trying to go. And also, it's a language that is starting to be more globally adopted. So the finance industry in particular has latched onto this in the way that they didn't latch onto the Millennium Development Goals. This has really been it has captured people's attention. So us aligning to that, we think makes sense, rather than just reinventing the wheel. At another layer down, what we try and do is, it's very difficult to compare, apples and oranges and pears of the impact investing space when you're trying to do something that's in early childhood education and compare that to the carbon emissions that you're avoiding from a solar fund, and compare that to a make something up for me, people, something like employment opportunities for long-term unemployed. How do you compare those things? Coming to one single golden number that helps you compare it, I think, is ridiculous and a waste of time to try and get to that point. So why don't we just accept that those things are all different, but just find a language that helps us bring some order to them. We have liked the way the Impact Management Project, which is a group of organisations around the world, are trying to do that. So they're trying to bring that conversation together. It's not perfect. We've trialled it this year for our impact report, and there are things that we don't like about it. There are things that we're like, oh, that doesn't really work for us. But there are some things that we do think are really valuable in this. So we'd rather be part of kind of getting it to a point that it's uber useful than abandoning it and just going our own way. So it talks about 5 dimensions. What is the impact that you are delivering? Who? So who is that impact being delivered for? Okay, so who are the beneficiaries? Who is the group of people that you are saying you are helping or supporting? How much impact is being delivered? Is it a lot of impact, or is it is it deep impact? If you're getting someone who's been unemployed for the last 10 years, if you're supporting them into a job, that's really deep impact, versus, helping someone be a little bit better trained or a bit better educated for maybe a job opportunity in the future. Both are good, but one's much deeper than the other. Contribution, what is the contribution that you are making through this activity relative to what otherwise would have happened? And risk, what is the risk that that impact won't actually be delivered, or that there's adverse impacts that you didn't plan for. So that's the second layer, and then the third layer for us, and I'll finish there, is around the individual metrics. So for every asset, we want to look at have individual metrics that we've defined to say these are the things that we are capturing data on. So for a solar farm, it's the easiest, the number of megawatt hours, which helps us then to define how many tonnes of CO2 have been avoided, how many million litres of water have been saved, because generating electricity through solar is much less water intensive. So those are individual metrics that we then capture data on. That's it from me.
Yeah, cool. So
Any questions before I hand to Hannah?
intrigued about how like, measuring social impact, for example, it's easier to measure energy,
Yep.
very easy, compared to someone's employment prospects or a further cost saved by getting them employed or the costs associated, a bit more of a wiggly line, and you can connect it to one person successfully getting employment, and that, how does that individual from an ethical point of view feel like having their life story reported back to a financial investor? It seems to be much more complex on those social issues than it does say on green climate change.
My observation is far more complex, yes. And I don't know, there's people in the room that I know have worked in some of that complexity probably more than I have, so feel free to jump in, anyone, if they, but my observation would be part of that comes from how do you have, so maybe I might share most recently something that we've done, and it probably goes to the conversation we had this morning around how do we make the finance work for the outcomes that we want, not the outcomes work for the finance. Like how do you change that power dynamic? So something we did recently was it started out as a small loan. We had a startup come to us who are placing people on the autism spectrum into software testing jobs. Many of those people have never been able to get through an interview process. They just find the whole interview process quite challenging. So many of them have been long-term unemployed. They came to our venture capital fund and did not meet our financial return requirements for the venture capital fund. But we loved what they were doing, and so we said, well, how, us sitting here as a venture capital fund saying, we love what they're doing, but no, we're not going to invest in you, like that's a bit, that whole power dynamic is just off. So we sat down with the founder and we said, look, we can't invest from there, but we've got other pots of money in other places, like we're at the foundation. What would it look like rather than us telling you yes or no, what if we started from a place of what would be the most founder-friendly, impact-centric way that we could support you with finance? What would that look like? And so with the founder, we worked with them and we ended up coming up with something that was not equity. Okay? So we did not invest in their business in an equity way, which is actually not that. Typically most founders, it's their, their and their team's blood, sweat and tears that go into it, and we're owning a big chunk of their business, is typically not that founder friendly. And also you're often looking for an exit, so the business to be sold at some point, which most founders don't have any, don't really want to sell their business. So it ended up being a piece of debt, so we lent them money, but it doesn't feel like debt. So it doesn't feel like they don't have to pay us back principal and interest every month or every quarter, because that's also as a entrepreneur, you think, gee, I've got to pay back this debt, and having that hang over you. So it gets paid back kind of like a HEX debt, like a student loan. As their business grows, they pay a percentage of their revenue back to us. So they only have to pay it back if they actually have the revenue to pay it back. Yes.
I just want to touch on this measurement question. I think when we do measurement, this sort of kind of empowering relationship where you, so Dan's talking about empowering an organisation to kind of to influence and drive in terms of the finance. I think in measurement, the goal is to try and do the same. And it's hard because you actually have to talk to people on the ground, but to say to them, what matters to you? What are the changes in your life that you want to see? And what is meaningful in terms of that for us to measure and report and to base, possibly base payments on. And then what they see is that somebody a long way down the chain, possibly an investor, is only making money if the things that they've said are important to them are achieved. And in that way, we align the sort of incentives of everyone involved, but also, I guess, the goal is to empower that person who is receiving the services to influence the measurement process.
Yeah, that's where we ended up. So we structured the loan in a way that was founder friendly, but then we actually we had to get this conversation around, well, what are the outcomes that we're trying to measure? Right? So the other interesting bit of it is the interest rate that this startup pays is determined by the outcomes. So every year we sit down with them at the end of the year and we retrospectively set what the interest rate was. So we say the interest that you have to pay for last year is, and the number is based on the outcomes that they have achieved. The more outcomes, the better the outcomes, the lower the interest rate. Okay? So they're a startup. If they were lending from a venture debt provider, they'd pay 15%. We said if you achieve no outcomes, you're paying 15%. Right? So don't run this business and pretend it's going to be impact. Like if you have no impact, you'll pay what you would have paid without as a non-impact business, right? But if you have great impact, we'll take 0% interest. That's where we started the conversation. Okay? So then we had this challenge of, well, how do we decide what determines that interest rate? What are the outcomes that we need to, because it's complex. And as finance people, we sat there going, well, it should just be like number of placements, like they're placing people into jobs, like just number of placements, like that's easy, that's simple. And then it wasn't until Erin, our CIO, got into a much deeper conversation with them and some of their stakeholders around the organisation. They're like, hang on, if we make it placements, we're actually incentivising them to just place people. Right? Whether it's the best outcome for the people they're placing, whether they could be taking someone out of a job that they love or something that they're doing that they love and placing them into a job that they don't love or don't get anything out of, like that's actually not what we want to be incentivising people to do. Do we want that to be part of what we're measuring? Yes. So placements is one of a couple of measures, but one of the measures is actually a well-being score based on a conversation that happens with the people that have been placed around how they are feeling about how their life is today relative to before they were placed into that job. So that gives them voice and agency in how they are actually determining how that business is performing in terms of the impact it's saying it's going to have. But it's bloody complex.
I just had a question with the story you've got on the screen.
Yes.
Have you guys looked at using the indicators that have been developed around the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as part of a framework if you guys are expanding into the, what I'm reading there, your reconciliation space and better engage? I'm just asking, have you guys looked at having a lens to some degree using existing frameworks that have been developed?
Yes, but I don't know where we're at on that. So yes, I think there's been three that we've like different three kind of ways of thinking around this that we've been sort of figuring out how do we want to think about this, but I don't know where we're at on it at the moment.
Right.
Yeah.
Sick.
I'm probably going way over time, so I'm going to hand to Hannah.
Welcome, good morning everyone. My name is Hanna Ebeling. I'm the Chief Investment Officer at SEFA. SEFA is a social finance intermediary social debt fund, impact investor here in Australia. We're one of 3 funds in Australia that were kick-started with the Commonwealth grant about 8 years ago. And we are based in Sydney with a relatively small team and try to cover kind of this vast red continent. And I've got a big passion for blended finance, and I'll try my best to kind of as seamless as possible kind of pick up from where Dan left us in terms of giving a great overview of the impact investing landscape, which is very complex, but I find personally also very, very exciting. I want to kind of start off with obviously SEFA being a financial intermediary, and like a lot of other organisations such as Social Ventures Australia, Foresters Community Finance, used to be a player in there as well, IIG, TDI. There's a couple of organisations that are really looking to see like, well, how can we bring the capital that is on one side to the social outcomes on the other side, and kind of what are the different iterations, what are the different puzzle pieces that you need to solve Because I think what was great, how Dan started us off with this analogy around the big house, you know, the complexity. And if we now step it up a notch in terms of blended finance, I would describe it that the room of blended finance, every time you go into it, it looks different. You will never be able to find a blended finance room that really looks exactly the same. In fact, a lot of times it's a clean slate, there's nothing on the walls. You have to bring your home decorators, your tradies, and you will have to build that room to basically create the vision of the blended finance transaction that you want it to be. Because there's so many different puzzle pieces, you know, pieces of furniture, different shades of colors, and you are basically in the midst of it creating the opportunity. And I think that's where there's potentially a really crucial difference between like more traditional, and it's not even, I guess, in itself traditional impact investing, but something like green bonds, which is a little bit more akin to more traditional finance products, and blended finance that is really, really different. And to continue with that beautiful analogy with the animal, if we then look at what would blended finance look like, I would say, like, yes, in the ideal world where you have those two financial returns, social outcomes, and you've got the best worlds together, you could talk about it as, you know, the unicorns of social finance. But I would say blended finance, they're zebras. They're basically unicorns with stripes. And every zebra, as I've been told, has got unique stripes. So even though they all look, you know, the same, they're unique in its own form. And basically, you know, that I think is the challenge around blended finance, like trying to fit like that new paradigm of social returns and capital, and how does it fit for that kind of unique situation. And so today I wanted to give you that, obviously, the introduction to blended finance, and hopefully, you know, demystify it a little bit. And then to keep it simple, I've got the 4 Ps of blended finance for you to take home and kind of ponder about, and hopefully also salt and pepper it with some good examples around what does blended finance look in practice, like how can you actually then take action from here and actively work through opportunities for yourselves. And I think, because I asked Dan obviously to also kickstart us off with that whole finance funding spectrum, when you've got, you know, grants, impact only on the left-hand side, and then the very traditional business potentially doing harm. So again, to make it more complex, I've just flipped it, you know, left to right in terms of the mainstream market company. And you've got a lot of people talking about impact only, impact first, as you're kind of hovering around the left-hand side of the spectrum. And then the more you're looking into mixing a little bit more financial returns into the equation, you're coming to like finance first, impact investing, and then obviously all the way to normal market stream companies. And I'd say that whole space around blended finance is probably really kind of playing around here, where you've got kind of that grant as an ingredient. You've got impact investing, you've got concessionary debt, and we'll go through all of these terms and what they mean, but it is really not necessarily really, you know, only seeking that beautiful unicorn and combination of, you know, really strong financial return and social outcomes. It's really playing more around the kind of impact first and trying to achieve that blended outcomes. And I know it's always easier to start the conversation, and whilst we want to, you know, create system change and kind of what they talk about, decommoditize social finance from like the traditional meaning and words, I think it's always really easy to kind of pick people up where they kind of the traditional words and descriptions. So if you look at kind of the commercial impact and commercial investing landscape, you would have, you know, angel capital for startups or venture capital funds. You would have growth capital, and then mainstream finance, where you would go, you know, just to go to normal bank a lot of times, then take on debt as a proven successful business to grow. And if you look at social finance and the different development stages that, like, a startup, social enterprise goes through, the kind of early stage, that's where a lot of the philanthropic capital is effectively equivalent to like the equity capital from an angel investor's higher risk, prepared to obviously, you know, in this case, non-repayable at all, but obviously the risk there is around actually achieving the social outcomes. And then as organizations kind of built up a track record, are able to, you know, have a little bit more capacity to pay investor returns, it's that growth market where, you know, depending obviously then on the risk appetite, impact investors come into play and structure all these, you know, interesting combinations, especially also around blended finance. And then I guess the ultimate goal is to mature them into mainstream finance. I mean, ideally into a system changed mainstream finance, but in a way, we always talk about around SEFA, our main role is to effectively make ourselves, redundant. If organizations have equitable access to finance and they're not relying on social finance and impact investors, in a new, different world, that would be the ideal outcome. And so I think this is kind of SEFA on a page in terms of, bringing borrowers, and a lot of financial intermediaries work the same way. So you've got investors, you've got borrowers, and then you've got, I always say kind of the impact structuring magic happens in terms of, bringing people on a pathway around like what are the different opportunities to create blended deals, direct lending, co-investment, doing advisory service around helping organizations get investment ready, and then at the same time also build organization capacity in organizations, make sure they're becoming more financially independent, and the ultimate goal we are all working towards that social impact outcome. But I wish, in real life that puzzle piece or that journey was always like kind of so easy. As I said, in terms of blended finance, you can take many different paths to actually get to the social outcomes, and sometimes it's a detour or you're in a holding pattern, depending. But I think in the end, I find the blended finance outcomes are a lot of times very deep and meaningful, and basically without people putting in the effort, they wouldn't be there at all. And so I think interesting actually in terms of this whole kind of blended finance is also that unlocking capital and using different capital sources for specific intentful purposes. For example, just to give you an idea, so SEFA was kickstarted with about $20 million, $10 million of government grants, $10 million of private capital, so there's that one for $1 famous match, or kind of leveraging, as they call it in the traditional financial world. And so to date, we've dispersed $35 million in kind of impact debt. We've currently about 50 million outstanding, so I guess we are doing a good job at lending because we're actually getting repaid the capital and recycling it into new projects. And overall, in total, including the 35 million, we've basically facilitated a total of 80 million into the sector. And that is the SEFA direct loan, so that's the 40%. But we've also actually worked with one of the mainstream banks in terms of external debt, and I'll give you a pretty good example in terms of how social finance can work hand in hand with more traditional finance. We've then obviously sometimes got organizations who've got a client contribution, whether it's in form of cash reserves or they're doing a crowdfunding campaign to make their own contribution, equity, and then a more growing market that I'm very interested in is the whole kind of syndication or co-investment. There's a lot of high net worth individuals or foundations who don't necessarily, they want to place capital for good, but they don't necessarily have the resources to actually originate the transactions, structure the transactions, and then execute them. So we're actually more and more inviting other investors to come alongside SEFA, in this case, kind of lend for purpose. And then also the grant money, and obviously the grant money, as I already alluded to, is very important when it comes to creating blended transactions. They can be private philanthropy, but they can also be government infrastructure grants. So this is kind of, I guess, the different puzzle piece or the different kind of ingredients when you're standing as a cook, as the blended finance cook in the kitchen. You've got all these different ingredients, and then it comes down to like, how much do you need of each ingredient to make it work? And so to keep it simple, I'm going to break it down into the 4 Ps of blended finance. And the first one I want to talk about is pathways. And I think it's already kind of very similar to that picture that I drew around the zebra with the different stripes. Every pathway is different for a blended finance deal, because I think there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of passion, because a lot of times it does involve philanthropy and grant making, because it's only kind of, I guess, earlier stage spectrum, and the spectrum where organizations are not necessarily able to pay a full financial return to the impact investor. So I think it's really important to find a pathway that works for the organization and kind of creates that kind of, potentially from startup or just, taking on investment for the first time. Where are we now at point A? Where do we want to get at point B? And what is the most appropriate capital structure and most importantly, most, I guess, responsible capital structure that gets us from point A to point B, in terms of finding these pathways that, ideally put them in a more impactful position, but also in a more financially sustainable position, without being that burden that Dan kind of alluded to. And so the different pathways, I try to give you now a couple of mechanisms or instruments, and I think it hopefully illustrates a little bit like what are examples of like how can you create these pathways for blended finance. And one of the innovative capital structure is what I call the, accelerator, where you've got, like the seed, the startup, growth established all the way to, expansion and mature for, organizational development pathway. And a lot of times it's the foundation brand that actually takes the risk to create a prototype, or they call it a minimum viable product, kind of bootstrapping it and trying to prove that a concept actually works. And then basically, you can create other more patient capital, concessionary capital solutions that I'll talk about in a minute, to kind of then help people, take that leap onto the next stage, when the ultimate goal would be potentially getting an impact investment in form of debt, where you actually pay a normal more commercial interest rate, those unicorns transaction where you've got still great social impact, but you actually get the market returns that about 2/3 of all impact investors are thriving towards. So there's a lot of work in terms of creating that pathway in a responsible way for investors to say, like, where do we start? What's the next step? So a lot of times it's also that vision already. Well, organization, if you get the grant and everything goes well, we're not going to leave you hanging. You've got like a follow-on kind of agreement around what's the next kind of piece of capital that is appropriate and kind of helping you on that trajectory to accelerate financial and social outcomes. Ooh, that one, I don't know. I'm not. Dan said he's not very good with social the measurement. I'm not an expert in Canva. That's like this, actually Australian unicorn in terms of design. So I don't know. It went a little bit hayway there, but I know it's supposed to say the gap, which is, I think, in Australia impact investment, it's kind of that famous gap that everybody talks about. I call it the valley of death. I know it sounds pretty harsh, but a lot of times it's when you still imagine that trajectory of, a social enterprise starting out, you get that foundation grant, and you've got that impact investment capital at the horizon. That's where you want to work towards. So a lot of times they say if you lose all the capital up from the family, friends and fools in the first kind of kickstarting, it's that nobody wants to give you that money where it's kind of half-baked. You haven't really proven your concept, like you're kind of a little bit too developed to kind of still re-tap into that grant funding. And so I think that's the wicked challenge in terms of how can we solve that valley of death. A lot of times it's what we call working capital. So it's a loan that's not secured against property. It's a loan or an investment that is used to hire more staff, invest into marketing. So, without the bricks and mortar, and a lot of times also, especially for employment-based social enterprises, they've got limited profitability. There is that additional social cost around training and employment and employing people. And I think there's also that general misconception, or like the general challenge that there's not a linear profitability of social enterprises, because that's not the main goal of the social enterprise. So the more you grow, you might still just only make $100,000 surplus because that's all you need for rainy days. Whereas in the more traditional world, everybody would talk in you need to make 10% of revenue in terms of profit. So there's a lot of difference between financing social enterprises and more traditional businesses out there. But after painting the picture of gloom around valley of death, I've got basically what I believe is kind of a solution around, it should say, equitable access to capital. So what are the different kind of more patient capital structures, or really kind of different blended capital path or compassionate solutions around concessionary debt? So that's debt that is taking lower than market return. Dan already said, you've got the great example for that one social enterprise around revenue-based loans. So loans, again, that is actually mimicking the return of like more of an equity investment, which is, higher, a little bit higher risk, less of a burden of an organisation, forgivable loan, or potentially a guarantee on a loan from a granting perspective. And what the structure that Dan said in terms of the investment linked to the social outcomes, there's an example around a social success node that's very similar concept that the Rockefeller Foundation has developed and is currently trialing around really linking financial returns to social outcomes and actually creating that alignment in terms of actually the more social outcomes you're generating, the less financial return you would expect as a system-oriented impact investors. And I know this is probably all a lot of information, but I want to leave you with that idea around really exploring the concessionary interest rates. There's now new PAF guidelines, the private auxiliary funds. I believe it's already permissible for charitable trusts in public auxiliary funds, that there's a lot more efficient charitable giving structures allowed for impact investment. So that means, for example, if you've got a concessionary loan, and let's assume you're charging the organisations 2% compared to the benchmark of 8% per annum, you as a philanthropist would be able to write off that differential between the 8 and the 2%. So the 6% you would be able to count towards your charitable donation. So there's not a cash outflow per se, because obviously you're forgiving that, but in terms of the accounting, how you would basically justify to the ATO, how you would actually satisfy your charitable giving requirement for the year, that would count towards it. For now, these PAF guidelines are obviously only allowed for DGR1 registered. It would be perfect if it was a little bit more wider spread towards social enterprises and profit for purpose organisations in general. But it's definitely something that I would really encourage you to look into, because that is a really wide, beautiful toolbox, especially for foundations, to create very unique and very impactful blended finance debt instruments. Other innovative capital structures are the different kind of capital layers. The Amazon rainforest analogy there, where you're basically trying to create capital structures, whether it's slicing, dicing, layering, basically different puzzle pieces coming together. And just to give you a couple of examples of what people use, they say like the equity piece could be, for example, in the form of a grant. It could be, like they call it, either a soft loan, patient loan, concessionary loan. So anything that is a little bit more forgiving than a normal traditional commercial loan. You are talking about what they say mezzanine finance or subordinated debt. So in the traditional world, that's normally debt that definitely takes higher risk. So it's sitting a little bit further down in that kind of capital stack. A lot of impact investors are now getting more. Even SEFA is also now exploring this space. So how can we fill that uncomfortable missing gap between the equity piece and what I would call them like more senior debt or potentially institutional capital from super funds that is probably a little bit more rigid in terms of return expectations, or potentially the corpus from a foundation where it has to meet certain kind of trustee expectations. And you can then otherwise also work with other instruments around doing a loan guarantee, for example, on that senior debt piece, to give a little bit more comfort to traditional investors. So there's like a lot of different tools in the box that you can put together in all sorts of different, you could make this piece obviously a lot larger and that small. So there's all that, individualistic structuring that I already alluded to earlier. That's all possible. And that is the, you'll get the slide sent around, and I'll make sure to include the link to the social success note, which is actually very similar to the revenue-based loan that Dan spoke about. So the Rockefeller Foundation, together with UBS Optimus Foundation, they have developed this concept, which is the social success note, which is an alignment of financial returns and social outcomes. And the big difference is that basically if the social organization achieves a social return, both they basically get a kicker or kind of a top-up payment in form of lowering their finance cost, and under this model, the investor also receives a top-up. So it's kind of interesting, and this, I mean, it's everybody kind of is aligned in terms of the three parties, but most of the work is obviously still done by the social organisation. So it's that similar concept. It's a similar concept to really try and change the way we talk about social outcomes, financial outcomes, and make sure they're a lot better aligned. The second P that I want to talk about is partnerships, because having all these complex pathways, it's really important that you've got strong partners. And like I mentioned before, blended finance, it's kind of coming into that empty room, and you have to make it your own. Where are we now? A, where do we want to get to? B, and never lose sight of that point B that we want to get to, because otherwise, with all the different pathways, that are possible, it's really important to kind of lose that sight. But at the same time, it's also really important to have a common language and a common understanding, and have a lot of openness and transparency, and building these partnerships. And that's, I think, the first example that I wanted to give. So my other passion area is around housing, more affordable and a lot of times more community-led housing. So I actually structured a larger debt investment or syndicate for a group called Nightingale Housing in Melbourne, who want to kind of basically create more greener solutions, but most importantly also building for community instead of developer profit in the more urban context. And so that kind of, in a way, blended finance model was that there was ethical private equity investors for about a quarter of the investment amount. And then SEFA only contributed 8%, so we did a mezzanine, this subordinated tranche, that uncomfortable middle piece in the sandwich, and then we invited NAB as providing senior debt, which obviously from a cost of capital perspective, they're a lot more competitive than SEFA, because they're a deposit-taking institution. We are raising capital from high net worth and foundations. But I'd say still, without that 8%, that kind of loop wouldn't have closed. They would have needed to either under a lot of time pressure and challenges to raise additional equity, and that was a lot more rigid in terms of their credit policy and what they were willing to lend. So putting in impact investor in that kind of blended capital piece really helped to unlock the whole transaction. So that was, I think, a good example actually of impact finance working with a more traditional finance world. Third P is passion, and I'd say, you kind of already kind of guessed, with different pathways available, you've got a lot of different partners in the mix, you do need that passion. And I think a lot of times it's also that emotion around, like, yes, I really want to make sure that this is a really wicked problem, but how do we create a solution? How do we create a blended solution? And a lot of times I think it's also the passion, obviously. Yes, you can look at the social impact measurement, but a lot of times it's like, what do you believe in as a person, especially as a philanthropist? Where do you want to place your money? What is important to you? And the passion is also really important too, because you can imagine these projects take sometimes a lot of time to get them off the ground. So passion is the fuel that keeps the conversation going through these kind of longer extended periods of time. And I think one of those kind of passion examples was a lovely, amazing lady I've been working now with for the last, I've gotten to know in 2014, now coming into the 5th year, Jenny, from our community project near Wollongong in New South Wales, and they had this dream of setting up a culturally appropriate and more affordable funeral service, and they worked on it for 7 years in total from within the community to actually get the startup off the ground. And I had the pleasure of working with her for 2 years to get that first social enterprise started. They are now looking into franchising that particular social enterprise model across Australia. But that was really the first blended transaction that I worked on, and it took me 2 years to basically, I think it was in total 750,000, so really not big by even impact investment standards. And so the SEFA loan was 40%. We were able to secure a capital grant, so a very strategic grant, and I guess quite risk-taking from the Vincent Fairfax Family Foundation, because a lot of times as a philanthropist, obviously the currency that you're thinking in is impact. And so if you are investing in a startup, social enterprise, there's no certainty and guarantee around impact. It could completely fail, and then your social return is potentially zero. If you're looking at it very harshly, but they made a conscious decision that they said, well, if we make a strategic round once, and we help this social enterprise get off the ground and they are self-sustaining, then basically, we are not going to be contacted ever again for more like an operational or program-related grant. So that was the thinking behind them putting in $300,000 at the beginning. And then the remaining balance was that crowdfunding campaign that they ran on the back of an ABC documentary of their project. And I think that they raised in total $120,000 or $130,000 from within the community, which really kind of showed you how much demand and I guess also how much energy there was from the community for this startup. The fourth P is persistence, because you kind of already guessed the whole 2 years, and I'll give you soon an example of where it took us 4 years, not full time, but took us 4 years patiently waiting around persistence, and it comes back to that element around partnerships and somebody having to take the lead in the transaction. Somebody has to be effectively the project manager and making sure that you keep up the momentum, or you check in at crucial points of time where there might be an opportunity to apply for a grant, or you might want to check in if an organization was successful with a grant application, which could potentially be that domino effect, or somebody putting the first money onto the table and then everybody else kind of falling into place and creating the complete puzzle piece. So persistence is something that's really important in blended finance, and this is another case study, and we are absolutely chuffed that we've recently came to when they were kind of breaking ground. It's an arts organisation called Shopfront in southern Sydney, and they wanted to expand their beautiful arts performance and kind of office space as well, to be able to generate a little bit more tenancy revenue from subleasing the additional space to other smaller arts organisations. They are leading in engaging young people with a disability and accessible arts programs, but also engaged with disenfranchised youth at different schools. And there you can see the blended finance piece took it to a completely different level, because that's maybe also why it took us kind of 4 years to bring it all together. There was a SEFA line for only 30% in the end of the total captive pie. There was a federal government grant, 28%, state government grant, 8%, club or industry grants, 12%. Then again, we were able to convince Vincent Fairfax Family Foundation, well, just help one time, why don't we want to come on board again for a second time? And then Shopfront contributed 5% of their own money, that important, what we always call skin in the game, for the organisation as part of the transaction. So all these different kind of stakeholders in kind of creating that pathway of what does it actually take to do, I think it's close to a $2 million renovation project for pretty much grassroots organisation that has been doing some really great work in southern Sydney. So really, really pleased that this is finally happening. And so in terms of now getting to the next step in terms of how to take action from here, a couple of thoughts around well, if you want to look for blended finance opportunities, what is kind of the lens that you want to put on? And a lot of times we always use the 5 C's of credit, but I think a lot more times I would actually call it, it's an investment. It's an investment in people, and it's an investment in purpose. And so if you look at the community organisation, what's really, really important is the character and the people, the management, the board. Are they really aligned? And it's sometimes quite interesting. A lot of times we've seen that actually management and the board are not very aligned when it comes to impact investing. A lot of time management is very much at the forefront, groundbreaking innovation, but then you do sometimes have conservative boards around well, debt is a dirty word. This would be irresponsible from a trustee or director's perspective to allow an organisation to have that additional burden. So I think it's really important to build that trust and that relationship. And a lot of times, as foundations, you already have that trust relationship, but it's definitely not easy to kickstart the conversation of transitioning a grantee to an investee. it's where it's important to have that open and trusted relationship. Capacity is really important, not from a necessarily resourcing perspective. It's kind of systems. It's just the idea of potentially growing and doing more with more, but actually being able to manage that additional capital. So capacity in terms of what is the support from potentially an advisory board or mentor that can kind of really help the organisation on the journey is really important. Then the third C around conditions. I mean, that when it becomes a little bit more technical and nitty-gritty, for example, in the example that Dan gave in terms of the condition of the loan agreement, that's really when it comes to documenting, potentially even as a grant or concessionary debt, what is the conditions that you have to meet before we give you the money, which are always the conditions that are much easier to manage, I can tell you, than the conditions that you have to meet after you've given the money and you've opened, the floodgate. But a lot of times we've got a lot of loans where organisations need to meet certain reporting or other financial outcome measurement and conditions through the life of the loan. Capital, that really comes down to what does that capital stack look like? What are the different puzzle pieces? How big are they? What do we think is appropriate? And for example, we do a lot of the structuring where we look at an organisation at the moment, an Indigenous preschool, and yes, we could give them a larger loan, but it would be irresponsible as a social lender for us to do so. So in the end, we say we know that they still need 1.2 million in addition to the government grants that they've already secured, but we can only ever responsibly give them 400,000. That's what we've seen as the maximum capacity in terms of taking on debt and being able to comfortably service that debt. And so then it comes down to, but if we, were to find, for example, a foundation who does the concessionary loan, we believe they can service 600,000. So all of a sudden that gap then becomes smaller, and you need to potentially then raise less capital in terms of, grant contribution. So that's kind of this puzzle pieces and creating these different capital layers and using the different kind of instruments that I alluded to earlier. And then collateral, a lot of times kind of security. As a lender, it's always going to be part of the equation. But we talk about, for example, taking security in terms of mortgage if there's a property involved. But it could also be, that you want, for example, a particular person as an asset to say we would like to make sure that that person stays within the organisation, or you have to notify it. That's a little bit related to the conditions of the investment that you're gonna make. But especially as a debt instrument, collateral in terms of what's that worst case if things go to custard, as they always so famously say, what is kind of the fallback or an alternative exit for your loan. And then another really important message I want to leave you with is this whole idea around investment readiness. I mean, all the creating pathways and actually getting an organisation from A to B, there's a lot of pre-work in the 2 or 4 years that I alluded to in terms of working with the organisation, creating the capital layers, putting together the mix and managing all the different partners in terms of creating those pathways. So there's currently actually a national sector investment readiness fund that's managed by Impact Investing Australia and funded by DSS available, that actually allows organisations to hire professional advisors such as SEFA or other consultants to help them along that journey. There's also now a couple of foundations who are actively actually investing or providing grants to organisations if possible, if granting is an option for organisations actually to get additional assistance, or for example working, Impact Seed is doing basically that role here in WA around helping organisations get investment ready and putting all the different puzzle pieces together. And then last but not least, I think the most important message in this great, this life cycle of innovation, in that, you have got this amazing idea and it kind of all falls apart as people, take certain chunks off, and then you have to kind of mush it all back together and try to, see what's the actual art, what can we actually make happen. It's really around that patience. It's a little bit, persistence is really for me, this idea of forceful driving, not losing sight of what's that outcome be at the end that you want to achieve. But a lot of times it's just that, you can feel the frustration. I can certainly I felt before we're oh, it's not happening, or you get some bad news, and it's that patience and, you know, wanting to actually achieve a very deep and meaningful outcome for organizations that I believe without blended capital would not be appropriately resourced. So from a depth of impact and really catalyzing change, I think blended finance transactions are very unique in that place. And, you know, somebody to take, basically lead the partnership as part of creating that pathway, I think that's a very, very important role, because otherwise a lot of organizations don't necessarily have that capacity to go on through that journey themselves. And that's it. I'm more than happy to jump on a Zoom call, because as I said, we are based in Sydney. If you've got any more questions, would love to, you know, hear from you and what's happening obviously in WA. In the slide pack, I've put a little bit more information around what SEFA does, but obviously the point here was really kind of to whet your appetite for blended finance. I hope I've set the expectation that it's, I find absolutely exciting. I can talk about it for hours, as you might be able to tell by now, but at the same time it's also not that easy. So you have to, you know, have the right partners and the right persistence and patience. But hopefully, hopefully you want to put it into practice, and I think it would be interesting now to, after break, right, to hear about a couple of kind of tangible opportunities in WA and how you might be able to apply that.
Thanks.
So yeah, but any immediate questions before we go into the panel later?
So not being familiar with these models and how they're applied.
Pardon, sorry then?
Not being familiar with these models and how
Yes,
they're
yep.
applied. What I think I'm hearing is there are in essence design principles that you apply in creating blended finance packages. So if somebody's looking to move into some collective giving space and create a foundation around this model, I'm really interested in the time frames that existed for some of the projects that you've worked with, 4 years, 7 years. Have you, and this may apply to actually anybody in the room, has anybody in working with ethics and design principles and culture started with the Uluru Statement from the Heart as the principle for the design prior to getting into the finance modelling, and then moving that towards defining the outcomes? Because one of the questions I've got is there are a lot of outcomes that we talk about in social impact, but we look at an end point instead of what should be the starting point. So I don't know if this is so new as a concept that nobody's doing it yet, or...
Well, I have to say I'm not an expert in design. I've definitely heard about it, and I've participated in a couple of sessions where you use the tools of design thinking. I think I would definitely emphasize that when I said this whole like A to B, without knowing where you are currently, especially around capacity as an organization, it's going to be very difficult to move to B. Even if all of a sudden everybody gives you, even, you know, let's say $1 million of free money, if you don't know how to integrate that into your business model, it's going to be challenging, even if you don't have that burden, for example, to repay it. But I think in terms of the design principle, like, I don't know whether you were alluding to that question, could we ideally make it happen faster within a year rather than obviously the 4 or 7 years? I think, you know, my dream scenario would be where like there's shared documentation, like open source, around, like, for example, a forgivable loan agreement, a concessionary loan agreement. How does, how do trustees from a foundation take comfort in, like, what's the commercial benchmark that we are comparing ourselves to? Is there any risk from an ATO perspective that, for example, we are going to be able to write off that concessionary debt as a charitable donation? So I think there's a lot more sharing and learning to be done within the ecosystem that hopefully you don't have to always reinvent the wheel. And obviously the more examples you've got of all these different structures, and you share them, hopefully you're going to say like, well, this kind of sounds about right. You know, we might just have to massage it a little bit rather than, you know, always, basically decorating the room, you know, all afresh. I don't know whether I'm answering the question, but I'm not really design expert.
I think maybe Tanya might have something to say on that.
Yeah, I was going to say this is just an interest point for me as well. And there are individuals around this country that are starting from the design principle of what's a First Nations-led solution. Let's start with that.
Yeah.
So it's not starting with
I need a 10% return, or I fit in this point. They're not many from what I can gather. I'm on an adventure to find them. You guys probably know of some others, but that are starting at that point. So for instance, for me, what does that look like with indicators that already exist? There are all these indicators around the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples that have been developed and have been developed over the last 10 years that fit this really well. Like, you go from this starting point, but a key starting point for me is meeting people, going, what would you like? And starting in a community and asking people from that perspective, and then slowly over time figure out how the financial mechanisms fit. So and there are other people in the country doing that. They're not starting at a perspective of these financial mechanisms can be tweaked, which is amazing what you guys are doing as well, but there are people coming from the other end.
Yeah, and that's the bit. So how do you get to that point first before moving through the financial mechanisms, and then you're looking at the outcomes, but the principle that you're working from fundamentally aligns with the Uluru Statement from the Harbour, for example. And what I'm seeing and hearing is the mismatch that's occurring around implementation from a policy perspective at government level. Businesses saying we will back the Uluru Statement from the Harbour, but nobody actually embedding it into how they operate fundamentally. And that's what I'm really interested in, is that how do we create that going forward? You've got a big grin on your face,
Yeah.
which is awesome.
Well,
So maybe I can chat to you afterwards. Is that
Yeah.
It is frustrating, but as we know, things are changing, which is fantastic, even from the government's point of view in regards to outsourcing, or Blairism reinventing itself in Australia all these years later. So outsourcing is something that's starting to come to foray, and for First Nations people that are starting to come to the table now, we're actually saying, well, we can help you. We can help you have the conversation with us, make sure we're at the table at the beginning of your planning process. Because what we've seen in the past, and it's right across all sectors, what we've seen in the past is that we've actually been brought into the phase where they're implementing, and when they do start implementing, for example, being at the Department of Water, sitting down, and they're looking at a huge planning process, but they're looking at trying to investigate how much water is in the Yarragadee, okay? And they come in and they say, right, we're going to do this, this and this, and I go, well, okay, how much money are you talking about? 50 million? Oh yeah, we've got 50 million sitting in there. How much of that is allocated for Aboriginal engagement? And the usual answer, and this is just right across, so it's just one example, the usual is, that's what they put up. In most cases you'll find in any sort of project that you're trying to enable in Australia, you find that if they're not included in the first place, this is the investment they're actually allocating for that. And they think that people like Oral and myself, we come for free. Because you're Aboriginal, you should do it for nothing because this is for you. Well, it doesn't occur that way. So things are changing, which is good. Which is someone's finally getting the message. But at the same time, we heard about this morning about the justice program. Simone McKirk was talking about in regards to the 120 project. Fantastic, but it is something that's been talked about for a long, long time. There is a good way of doing it, but what we find is if it's within government, they will do it their way. And they will actually, because they actually have Aboriginal people on staff, or even non-Aboriginal people on staff, who take up a role as in regards to, you're our, Anna, you're going to be our Aboriginal voice in this space, so can you please come in? She lives next door, or she's worked with Aboriginal people in the past, so you're our voice. That's the sort of stuff that we've actually been putting up with, so that's where the frustration comes from. And to change that, we actually start needing people like the Tanyas and that to start coming out there and saying, well, what do you want? What do you need? And then collectively, so the co-designing, as we heard in recent times, the wonderful wording of co-designing, actually starts fitting into a space where all of a sudden everybody's sitting down together going, yeah, if we go this way, no, we've been down there, this is what's happened. So let's just, you know, the pathway you talk about, fantastic. We know, we've been there on several times, so we know where we want to get to be. So the pathway is very important, but the reality is that the experience and knowledge and the understanding of where that Aboriginal community or the First Nations people are, if they're not at the table and you're designing or developing Aboriginal projects and addressing social outcomes or issues, and if they're not at the table, then you're always going to fail. So your investment that you're actually investing into the project is always going to be tenfold because you keep doing it. And as Einstein once said about insanity, is that we keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting it to change. Well, that's insanity. So the reality that we're faced with today is, let's be smart about it. If we're going to invest in this space, then let's try and do the smart thing. So bring the people to the table and work together. So that's what Aboriginal Australia is actually offering today. So it's fantastic.
Thanks all. We might break there for 20 minutes, and then when we come back, we'll talk a bit about opportunities within WA and have the panel discussion. So, there's tea and coffee at the back and some nice cakes and things. So this portion of the session is designed to provide an opportunity for any questions that you all have of kind of this intermediary sector, I guess, but also of each other, I guess. If there's additional questions that others can address, please, feel free to jump in. Sven's going to come and join the panel in a moment, but before he does that, I'm going to, Dan and Hannah, but I'm going to introduce you to Emma. So Emma Tompkinson, recently a senior consultant with Impact Seed, but also runs Community Insight Australia, which is a really interesting data mapping tool that she might want to tell us about, but you might want to have a look at. Not today. Let's just stick with one topic today. And so, I think I'll hand over to Emma to facilitate the panel.
Great. So we're going to start off. This is the launch of the Impact Investing WA Alliance is such a key moment for us in WA, I think. Some people might say we're a little bit behind in some aspects, but I think what that has given us is a really wonderful opportunity to be able to learn from what other jurisdictions have done well, what they haven't done well. And I think this is a brilliant moment for us to come together and say, right, let's have a unified, let's deliberately design what we want here in WA and let's make something amazing. So, first question to everyone, but Dan's going to start us off. What is the opportunity for WA in impact investing?
Sure. So I might answer that in two ways, if I could. I think the more conceptual answer is, I think I've heard a few people say to me today, WA's behind, or it's like we feel like we're behind where other states or other countries or whatever, however you're defining who you're behind. But I'm not sure, like maybe, I don't know, like maybe you are, but I think there's also a unique set of opportunities here. Like here in WA, I think the state of WA has a sense of itself that other states, maybe barring Tasmania, don't have, right? And I think that's actually a real opportunity. I think that's an opportunity to do things in a way that's connected to place and community, that for at least for non-Indigenous people, they don't have that same connection in other states. So I think that's quite a unique thing here. Obviously, for Indigenous people, they have that all around the country in terms of their connection to country. So I think that's interesting. I think there's obviously an economic mix that's quite unique here in terms of what the state produces and what work gets done in this state, which is different to other states, so that's quite unique. And I think also you're a little bit of and this is an outsider saying this, so I say it with love, you're a little bit of a victim of your own success in some areas because you actually have philanthropy that happens in WA that I think other states would only dream of, okay? So whether that's some private, very large private philanthropists, whether it's, I think Lotteries West is in the room, like that, that's providing opportunities in a philanthropic sense or dollars into the system that will get to margins of the system that those dollars don't get to in other places. So there is a little bit of a kind of like the things that sit on the edge in a Victoria are actually not on the edge here. That edge is different, those boundaries are different. So I think all of those are unique kind of ingredients in terms of what is here. And I think if you, like anything, if you start with what your strengths are, what the mix of ingredients you've got to work with, that usually uncovers or points you in a direction around what opportunities are natural to pursue. So that's the conceptual answer. The very practical answer is something I'm not meant to be talking about, but I'm going to share a secret with everyone because I trust everybody in this room to keep it, is one of the things we're hoping to launch whilst we're over here. We had breakfast with the chairman yesterday. Was an opportunity that came up. When was it? Was it a year ago or 6 months ago? I don't know.
Just over a year ago.
A year ago that Sven and Kylie introduced us to WA Super. WA Super were wanting to do a place-based impact investment mandate. So over the last year, we have been working with them in partnership to develop what could a WA impact fund look like, and what would it look like for them to seed that fund, to be the first cornerstone investor in that fund. And so I can't tell you the amount, but it's more than $19 million and less than $21 million that they will be putting in. And we were hoping to be able to officially launch that whilst we're here. But Tim talked about it this morning, so I feel like I've got permission to talk about it. We will launch it over the next month. It's just sitting with the lawyers and agreeing, words and things like that. The intention is already agreed. The willingness to do it is there. This will happen. It's really just at the documentation stage. And the fund itself, in terms of what it will be looking for. So, it's quite an open mandate. That was one of the things that we talked to WA Super about. Originally, I think they had a very much sort of kind of more narrower mandate around just very specifically social enterprise. And in conversation, I said, look, I just don't know how we would, I think there's the ecosystem here in terms of the intermediary ecosystem is not as, I don't know how you're going to develop that many opportunities if you keep the mandate that narrow. So I think it needs to be broader than that. I think Impact Seed will do a wonderful, we're partnering with some other groups in each of the areas that we'll invest, and Impact Seed are a key partner in that. So it will be able to engage in social enterprise or with social enterprises in different forms of finance, but we think predominantly it will be some sort of lending type activity to social enterprises. We're very interested in how some of the money can be used in regenerative agriculture. That will be another area, and I think there is quite a unique opportunity in that area here in WA. Part of the mandate will be around real assets, so things like property. Things like, we're very interested as a business, and we've been doing a lot of work in energy solutions for community assets. So where can you use renewables or solar often on community housing, which then results in cost savings to the housing providers that then flows into lower costs for people living in community housing. Likewise for assets like childcare centres where they're run by a non-profit organisation. How do you extract cost savings through smarter and more renewable ways of producing energy, that means that those cost savings go to the groups that the value should be going to. And I think so real assets would be another area, and then we have enough space in there to engage with the state government if they also want to develop social impact bond or social impact bonds. We would be able to invest in it from that pool as well. And so we'll start with more than 19 and less than $29 million in the fund. It will be focused solely in, it will only be deployed in Western Australia, so we'll not look at opportunities outside of Western Australia. And we hope that there will be other investors that want to come in behind WA Super. We expect that most of those, if they exist, will be also in WA. We might be surprised. You never know. But I would expect that if there is more money that comes in, that is probably from WA. And like we're doing this. Well, maybe I'll get to that in a minute. But so that's the sort of broad outline of that fund or that real opportunity. And we're very open to we're very open minded about how it could be deployed. Obviously, we have things that we have to meet in terms of the mandate that WA Super has given us. We don't just get to throw money at things we think are cool. We actually, there's a whole process and things that we need to follow. But that's the broad opportunity. I think there would also be this blended finance. That is an area we're very interested in, about how that money might play a role alongside other forms of capital, whether it be grant capital or other types of impact investment capital. We're really keen to support those sorts of transactions and structures and ways of supporting different enterprises. So yeah, that's that. For us as an organisation, the reasons why we're interested in doing it. So just to be blunt, it's smaller than we would typically do something of this nature. It's loss making for us to start out with, but that's okay. We look at this and we say we think it could be a really important sort of milestone in how things are developing in Australia around impact investing. No one's done a place-based something as specific as this, with a set of partners that are in that place and connected to that place in the same way all of the partners are. So we think that's significant. We also think that it helps to develop that intermediary, that sort of ecosystem of intermediaries. So all of a sudden, if you're working with social enterprises, or you're thinking about putting a social impact bond together, or you're doing a housing deal, whatever you're doing, you actually have a kind of place to orientate what you're building. So rather than kind of just building it and then hoping, like Field of Dreams, you build it and they will come, there's actually someone that you can go to, and will be this fund, to say, look, I'm thinking about building this. What would it need to look like? Right? Like, how do we work together on building something that works for you and that works for me? So we think that could be really important as well.
Great. So I'm going to fire 2 questions at all of them, and then we'll open questions up. So I'm sure that some of you have questions about the fund, but just hold them, write them down. Sven, on the back of that, what are the opportunities for WA, and I guess to more broadly with the alliance?
Well, I think the biggest opportunity and challenge with this fund is the biggest challenge is probably its risk tolerance, which is fairly low because it's been seeded by WA Super. And the need to go and find deals for that fund to invest in, because once you've got a fund, you need to find deals for it. So I think the biggest opportunity here will be leveraging Catalytic capital, which Dan has alluded to. WA's got a massive pool of the other states don't, through philanthropic funding, through Lottery West. I mean, we've said for a long time that Lottery West is one of the biggest risk capital funders in WA, but historically hasn't really had an appetite for social enterprise, but increasingly now, and I think Barry can speak to this. I'm happy to throw to you if you like. You've got an impact measurement model across 6 key outcome areas, and you look for sustainability. So in our heads, that makes Lottery West a very important catalytic funder, and through partnerships such as the blended finance partnership with SEFA, we think we can carry opportunities through pipeline from very, very early stage and high risk to a point where the fund can invest in them. And that's really the most exciting thing here, because we see the fund as a beacon and a mechanism to drive private capital towards better ways of doing business investment that isn't just focused on profit, but looks at the 4 returns, as Dave said this morning: social, environmental, cultural and financial. And I guess what we really need to get busy with now is just having a look at what are the opportunities out there that can kind of take advantage of this, and how can we better advocate for government through the Alliance to craft policy frameworks that will support projects along that pipeline towards investment. So I think we kind of flipped around the schedule a little bit, but there was a quick wins kind of concept, and I wonder if there might be an opportunity to sort of have a look at a couple of, we can't go on because we're on a tight timeline, but have a look at a couple of discrete opportunities and just kind of get a sense from potential funders in the room and this panel as to, you know, what kinds of capital might be required to move that along the spectrum. Have we got time for maybe, like, how much time have we got? 5 minutes?
20 minutes left.
Okay.
For the whole day.
Can I ask Justin and Oral to speak to, and Dave potentially to speak to that project that we've been discussing in terms of employment-based social enterprise that is looking at land regeneration, which ticks at least 2 of the elements off on that fund. Is that cool? Would you like to come up? I think we'll call it 5 and then we'll knock it on the head at 10.
Okay, try and be brief. You've got 5 minutes to share.
Geez, I wish I had a bloody slideshow.
I can bring that native title on that, possible.
Yeah, no, that's not, yeah. So what we've been working on is around, I don't know if anybody's aware of the FPC's forest management plan that is now called the Jarama plan. Well, Jarama, I sat on the panel that advised FPC for that development plan. And I convinced the panel that we had to give it a Nyungar name, and it wasn't just about the name, it was about the principle and the concept of what Jarama was about in a cultural context. The cultural context was that Jarama was not just about the trees and the forest, it was about the whole system. Each tree was an ecosystem in itself. So the system included the biota, the soil, the understory, and of course all the way up to the canopy. So Jarama is about managing that spirituality. In our cultural ways, every one of those species of living creatures, from below the soil to the above, all the way up to the sun itself, were part and are part of our kinship structure through our totem system specifically. So Jarama was about, and the Jarama plan therefore is about the spiritual, not just the physical, but the spiritual management of the forest as a system, as a resource for all of us. Now, what I've done with a couple of partners is set up Jarama enterprises, because what I did not believe was FPC, who's never engaged with Nyungar people, and the 2 areas that we've been speaking about, the agricultural sector industry and the forest industry, have excluded Nyungar people as custodians and traditional owners for the whole 190 years. So we have not been engaged at all in those industries. Certainly in the agriculture, as David spoke this morning, the clearing of the land, and then the slave labour, effectively, of our old people as cheap labour. So that engagement is fine. We've got stories, David got it with the Kickett side of his family, of where our old people had farms but could not maintain it because if this stuff was around, they could have. They couldn't access credit because they just weren't trusted and believed. So there's this history of Aboriginal opportunity or Aboriginal aspirations and vision, and then of course there's the colonising stuff of the history that we now are talking about having truth telling about all of it. With Jarman Enterprises, we said that if we could get access to biomass through FPC's current processes of managing the forest, and this biomass, I can tell you that FPC burn about 40,000 tonnes of trees and waste, what is effectively waste material from their saw logs and their forestry and timber activities. We were asking for 8,000 tonnes per year. The FPC have created all these barriers. We bid it in a tender that was at the beginning of the year. We missed out on that. So there's been all of this merry-go-round stuff that actually is about defying and denying our rights in doing our business as far as I'm concerned. So what's the issue? The issue is we've got technology through pyrolysis machines that are coming from, that don't exist currently in Australia. They're coming from the Netherlands. They're about $1 million per machine. In terms of the bigger, it's probably 500,000 or 600,000 per machine for the smaller, 2,000 tonnes a day pyrolysis machine, and then it goes up to 10,000 tonnes. But so the barrier is we needed access to the biomass, because then the provider, the manufacturer of it, in fact the broker, the distributor who's got the licence in Australia over in Melbourne, they would organise the finance for the purchase of the machines. Right? So this is the problem we've got. Bringing this new technology, Nyunga owned and controlled business that wants to get ahead of the pack with a brand new industry that will be created, because the biomass obviously produces biochar. Biochar in regenerative ag is already proven to be so significant, not just with the soil, but obviously the soil is a big one, but including breaking down the methane in the stomachs of cattle, right? Carbon credits in the soil and for these other processes. 3 other byproducts that are produced through the pyrolysis process is wood vinegar, pyrolysis oil and syngas. The wood vinegar, the pyrolysis oil and the syngas are both renewable energies and can be tweaked to fit biodiesel or diesel engines, and the syngas can be cooled down to a methanol fuel. So they're 2 industries. Now the wood vinegar has been really interesting because a few guys that have come to us, and you may have heard, those of you in agriculture may have heard about wood vinegar. It's called smoke water in Japan, and so it's around the world, it exists. But the wood vinegar it's got about 200 compounds. So we've got to do a whole lot of research to find out, what's there. But what we know is in some trials that Carbon Ag Solutions, a private company, have done, is they found that the wood vinegar is, it either deters and or kills the red-legged earth mite. So that's a significant impact for agriculture in terms of, people that don't know, red-legged earth mite is one that actually attacks the roots of any plant, crop, trees, whatever. So getting rid of those, because it's sprayed. So chemicals are sprayed predominantly to kill the red-legged earth mite. What we also now is these trials by Carbon Ag Solutions are now finding that on canola, it's also doing the same with the snails. So it's almost potentially saving the canola industry. Now, when you mix the wood vinegar with the biochar, it activates it in like a supercharges it, in terms of the release of carbon. So there's all of these things, and what we are held up right at the minute is FPC saying that they have not agreed to provide us with the 8,000 tonnes we need. We've identified that we probably need, because of the amount of R&D that we're going to have to do to determine and proof up, I guess, the whole thing. We know it works because it's happening in Europe. How well it works on our hardwoods over here is probably the biggest issue. But then there's all the R&D around the products themselves. Now what I've been saying to Duncan and our guys is that yes, the biomass and the access to the forest for the biomass is effectively helping Nyunga people to be reintroduced to the forest. So traditional burning becomes a part of it. I've been banging on about traditional burning as an 18 years firefighter, but also 11 years doing traditional burning on our farm. So to me, in WA, there's no more experienced Aboriginal person with the issue of fire than myself. DFES, my old mates, don't even get us through the door with that stuff. But this is a way of getting Noongar people back into the forest as traditional owners, reintroducing traditional burning, getting Noongars active in the forest, including camping and living in the forest to manage jarrah. Right? And then we produce the commercial products that actually allow us to justify a really good. So we've got to demonstrate and build, obviously, a business case for it all, which we're prepared to, but the investment is the thing that's holding us back. So that's been going on for 12 months, and we're sort of still sitting here waiting.
And so it actually fixes a lot of problems for other people who keep doing what Dave was saying, Einstein's definition of insanity. Keep doing the same things in the same way repetitively and creating, effectively a bigger problem. What I was referring to here also fixes a problem. It manages that forest country in state land as well as on private country. It manages a problem for people who don't really want to or know how to manage a problem. And it has a far lower carbon footprint in terms of emissions. It actually can provide a return back to private landowners as well as getting percentage of return of products. But above all, it actually is enabling and engaging Indigenous people into pathways for employment, innovation, in job creation, value-adding products, taking things beyond just a simple putting a piece of biomass through a process. It's pretty much just got an open-ended spectrum of opportunity to that. But in Hanna, in your presentation, it sits in the valley of death. And so that's when you've got such an amazing concept, technology is available, people are available, it's just primed, ready to go. On the government side of it, you've got the restriction of bureaucratic process. You can then apply this to freehold, so farmland, where you'll have a lot of people who are just willing and able to be engaged in the process, set the precedent that then the government then pick up on and then realise that it's actually the way forward. It is a good idea. You can't wait for government to innovate on stuff like this. I'm sorry, I don't have to do government bashing, but in terms of waiting for them to pick up an innovation, that precedent has to be set with private equity and enterprise.
So I think the question, or maybe a comment first, the comment would be that we could have had 3 or 4 case studies here illustrative of a carbon impact, a regional impact, a forest, a regen ag impact, or an example of an employment-based social enterprise, and this one kind of ticks all of those boxes, and there's a very strong cultural element as well. So that's the comment, and then the question is, well, what funders can we engage from foundations, family offices, and grant funders like Lottery West to help carry this through a blended finance model to proof of concept and beyond?
And in terms of an industry, I mean, it is a bona fide industry because there will be significant supply chains required in the production, transport, the logistics of chipping, the biomass, and then there's the traditional burning and the land management, the revegetation and rehabilitation stuff that, that Noongars should be engaged first up in. We don't need DDCA to tell us that we've got to start with, Certificate 2 Ranger training.
What's your timeline?
Look, it takes about 6 or 8 months to get these machines out, so we wouldn't be doing anything operationally until that time, so getting them out and then getting them through customs and then, reassembling them.
Great. I'm going to ask you guys to stay up here in case people have questions for you. And just one more question for Hannah before I open it to the floor. And just to Hannah, you've been primarily operating over on the East Coast. So what I'd like you to add is, given that we're not a completely blank slate, but I think we have more opportunity to design what we want. What would you do differently if you had the opportunity, again in New South Wales, or I guess what mistakes have you seen that we might want to avoid? Can you give us give us one or
Yeah,
maybe
sure.
a few pointers for really what we could do differently here in WA.
I think how, Dan said in terms of you've got all the ingredients on the table. I mean, I'm jealous of that big, Lottery West kind of grand capital. That's really important to create blended transactions. You've got a lot of the resource companies who I think are really, really well set to do a lot of what we call social procurement, to have, large contracts where you've got employment-based, starting from like cleaning, doing some, fencing or working in the production, but with a clear training and employment, creating pathways to employment outcomes. So you've got a lot of important stakeholders there. I think most importantly, it's bringing those stakeholders together and already have the discussion at the outset, how are we going to work together and become a little bit more collaborative, a little bit purpose and intent and driven from the outset, rather than like, oh, we're just going to try something here. We're going to create one transaction, for example, in the case of what, what I've just heard high level, it sounds like you want to ideally buy a prototype, prove that it's working. So maybe you might need, grant contribution, kind of buy that piece of equipment, give you some runway to, train and employ people and do it. But then if at the outset, for example, you've got a contract from government or one of, the big companies, like an offtake agreement, then all of a sudden becomes investable, because then once you know the operational risk of actually working the machine, delivering the biomass output is somehow mitigated, you've got that security revenue. That's pretty much what social procurement can do through government or big corporates. Then it becomes all of a sudden a very investable solution. And so I think it's important when I mentioned this, like, acceleration, or like have a pathway where it's already clear as a social enterprise. Well, we are starting off here. If we are meeting social and financial outcomes after 2 or 3 years, that's kind of the pre-commitment to funding to help us over that valley of death, for example, or then onto growth. So if you've got everybody already at the table at the outset, and not everybody might contribute at the outset, but you've got that clear vision that that's the pathway, I think then that's a lot of the learnings, I think, from the Eastern Seaboard. And then in terms of, if you were talking around the whole payment by outcomes of social investment bonds, I mean, SEFA hasn't been that much involved, nor have I really personally until recently. We've started participating a little bit more, but in terms of the time and resources that has gone into finding the right data, the so-called market sounding sessions, joint development phases, in terms of sharing from government to government kind of what works, what doesn't, I think that's really important to hopefully kind of leapfrog that a little bit more. I think that's kind of how I would probably approach those two different angles. Great. Questions to any of our panelists from any of you? Don't be shy. Well, I was going to say, if you don't have a proper question, throw them a little idea and make them expand on it. But
okay, I think just so I've had a few conversations with people on the panel, and it was really great to hear about the innovations that's coming out of the partnership with WA Super. I'm curious to know if there's anything else that the panel might be able to share with us that came out of the roundtable conversation this morning about where to from here. Yeah. Or was that the agenda? No.
I think, and I suspected as much would happen with the stakeholders in the room.
Oh yeah.
The conversation necessarily drifted away from impact investment and into government policy areas around program funding more broadly, which has a dotted line to draw back to impact investment, but it's not impact investment. I think in terms of the outcomes, what we hope that the ministers took away was that there is a reference group. It's very clear about its intent to develop an impact investment ecosystem with the fund as a beacon, and I would hope, based on our engagement with Treasury to date, that we will hear back from them as they iterate their policy, which started out being social impact bond focused, but I think we've been able to influence them to some degree around the importance of social procurement, building a social enterprise ecosystem, being a risk funder for early stage social enterprises, especially Aboriginal led social enterprises, and the whole toolkit impact investment beyond bonds.
Well, and congratulations everyone, I think, who was involved in it for taking that initiative. I think fantastic. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
I was going to say, I've just got a suggestion for the question that you had, Sven, on how do funders support this. I think it's doing a shout out to people and saying who genuinely, not just to come and chat, but get a group of people in a room that genuinely want to do something and get them sitting in there and directly with the people that are talking about this opportunity rather than through intermediaries and nut it out. That would be my suggestion as the first answer to your question, would be actually just have a focused group of people that are coming in going, I will commit something, anything, but I'm coming in to support, not coming in to take, would be my suggestion.
Great comment. And I might just add to that. In my experience of impact investing, whether it's conferences, every panel I've seen, literature that's written, launch events, the biggest issue that I've seen is that the people or organisations that are being invested in are not there. So I think if that's something that we can take through in WA, it not only improves our outcomes, but it also brings the heart back to the market. It's like, this is why we're all here. Let's stop talking about them and ask people to talk for themselves and listen.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
You were first.
I'm sorry. Just Oral, how high did you take your idea? It depends who you talk to in government, and considering from government, considering as one of the outcomes for this government is to improve the outcomes for Aboriginal people, and I'm in the Department of Communities, and it's hammered to us like you must be looking at these kind of outcomes. Where did you go? Have you spoken?
All the way to the Minister's office. We were there on Thursday night, or Thursday afternoon.
Yeah.
Footy on Thursday night. But look, and understand what you were saying, Tanya, as well. We haven't done this, at a level that hasn't impacted or hasn't consulted or, gone to the highest powers. I mean, Dave Kelly himself, the minister, stated exactly those 3 points. Out of the Jarrah plan, he wanted healthy forests, healthier forests. He wanted Aboriginal engagement, and he wanted Aboriginal participation and employment. So, here's a business that's delivering those. We can't do anything until we get access to. I mean, we can. There's two areas, and Justin mentioned it: the private farmers who have got remnant bush on their properties. Our core focus is absolutely about healing, making the forest healthy, right? Whether they be on private lands or on crown lands. The Nyungar settlement is what this thing's all about. We've got a joint management agreement and a collaborative management agreement that is still at the draft form. But the Nyungar Nation doesn't have a model yet, because we're not even involved in stuff for over 150 years. So there's this reality that the joint management is not going to be high-level stuff. It's going to be ranges. It's going to be stuff that we've been doing to death, that no one actually has created any innovation. What this is offering is a holistic approach to say that we're going to get Nyungars back in caring for the forest in a very practical way, because our philosophy is not, we don't want to be doing everything, we can't, but getting Nyungars in to move through the forest and do every aspect that I mentioned earlier is a critical part of it. And there's opportunities not only for that engagement and participation, but there's opportunities for contracts and subcontracts to be led. So there are all of the quadruple bottom line that people have been talking about in the one project, and that's why I think you guys identified it when I was talking about it. I mean, I also have, and it's good to see Melissa here, we've also got the Noongar Land Enterprise Group. I mean, for an example, we're talking about a Noongar branded honey product, a Noongar branded sheep product, a Noongar branded bush foods product. And the NLE is saying it's a collaborative approach that is, well, we've got 8 nations now which are forming across the southern half in a east-west alliance Because all their mobs, all the way to Yorta Nation over in Victoria, have said, you Nyungas have led the way, we want to copy what you fellas are doing. So this cooperative and collaborative model works, you know, and David's mentioned the treaty stuff. You know, my view is we need to be forming treaties and alliances with each other as Aboriginal nations, and then maybe coming with an approach. So, you know, there are lots of these models that I'm personally involved in. There's lots of things through the chamber, through, you know, our networks, where there are Aboriginal people creating and innovating all the time. But unfortunately, we don't, you know, we come from this social background, this financial and, capability background that actually hasn't afforded us. And so, you know, what standards sometimes around either compliance or security, you know, for finance and what have you, prevents us from actually participating at the right level and in the right way. But our core strength is about caring for country and being culturally accountable, and, you know, that ethical stuff around cultural integrity is critical. And if we can create new industries and create those commercial markets and those opportunities, you know, in an economic sense, for our people and everybody else, then surely that's worth investing in.
Thank you.
There's probably opportunity for multi-ministerial jurisdiction on this.
Yeah, definitely.
Is that where your option?
And send a letter. There'd be ministerial to respond to within the agency.
There is, and the alliances that we, not just this alliance that we talked about this morning, it's also in regards to the alliances that need to be established right across the southwest of Australia. So we talk about sales line. We've got Nalsama above the north, we've got the 10 Desert project across the deserts in the middle, and now we're talking in regards to trying to establish sales line across the south. But just to add to that, I can see some connection in regards to the stuff that Dan and I do in Forest Stewardship Council in regards to trying to set a standard from the international level, but for the Australian level, a standard that they have to comply with in regards to, you know, how they want to deal with their wood product. The issue that we see with Jorama is that Conservation Council are the ones who actually have the management order for the forest. So it's very hard to sort of wrangle that out of their little fingers and say, well, we'll give it to you Noongas, because it comes back to one little word called racism. Racism is also the little word that also goes into, we don't trust you, black fellas. Okay, we don't trust you with this sort of stuff, so we will, therefore, we'll put in place, Anna, you identified it correctly in regards to not only stakeholders but partners, but also governance structures that we can trust. Okay, even with through native title, you can see right now the ability of Aboriginal people to be able to stand up and say, oh, we can do this all by ourselves. No, but the government, on the other hand, come to the table and say, well, no, we'll put it into a trust because we don't trust you with your future fund. So that's the sort of stuff that, and it is relevant. I mean, whoever saw Adam Good's latest show would understand what racism is. But this is another form of racism that we see, and Oral spoke this morning in regards to, let's stop killing ourselves. If you're looking in this space, this is what we're talking about in social investment. Okay. Yeah, you want some money for a bang for your buck. Okay, well, there's ways of doing it. So in regards to the stuff that Oral's talking about, there's the First Nations people right across the world. Australia fits into the Oceania scenario in regards to Forest Stewardship Council. So Forest Stewardship Council have married up with the First Nations people because of the values that they adhere to. And those values are the ones that drive that partnership in regards to the forests all over the world. In November this year, they will be establishing a huge, big Indigenous foundation. As soon as I heard this is the sort of stuff that we talk about in regards to connecting First Nations people to that fund. So these are the things that we talk about, but there's always things in our space which the general finances say, well, oh, you've got the single Noongar, you've got 1.3 billion, you should be funding this all by yourselves. You know? And it's not just here, it's all over Australia where we've seen native title outcomes. People get paid and that money disappears because of, oh, well, we don't need to look after you guys anymore because that's your responsibility. Same thing happens here in this space here right now. Great idea, great for the economy, that local economy, but also for the employment and education outcomes. The things, the intangibles, the spiritual connection back to country, the cultural responsibility being taken back upon. These things can't be measured, but at the same time are very relevant to the Noongar nation. So for us, it's adding these things in. And so overcoming racism is one of the critical things that we need to do.
I think just a fact, I mean, with that, just a simple fact, is there are 600,000, there is, just in WA, the southwest, there's 600,000 hectares of really unhealthy forest. And people are, you know, we are all crapping ourselves about the time bomb that's sitting up in Kurramurra there, right, in terms of fire issue. There's this fuel loading, so there needs to be this ecological thinning that needs to occur. This is part of the process that we've submitted. We're saying we will do the ecological thinning, we'll pull the biomass, and then we'll create all of these opportunities with a commercial aspect to it. And the social returns are exactly all the things that people have mentioned. It's a no-brainer. You know, getting people, and it's not just about the Noongar people, it's about the local communities and the regional communities in areas that have relied on forestry, you know, like Collie, town of Collie and all those little towns throughout the southwest there that live in amongst the forest.
Great.
There's opportunities for everybody in those regional towns because it's it's literally it's a $500 million industry.
Yeah, great. I'd like to thank the three of you for making this very real and giving us a very real example. And the three of you just to my left from giving us the sort of the umbrella and the structure of impact, of the impact investing world under which it sits. And I look forward, as I'm sure everyone in this room can, to when these marry up and we can hear the awesome outcomes that you guys are achieving. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Kylie to round us out.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Anna. Can you join me in thanking all